All right, welcome everyone. Thank you all so much for joining us. This is the third Rulemaking Advisory Committee meeting for the Division 85 rules focused on permitting and mitigation in Oregon's wetlands and waters. Our meeting today will go until about 12 p.m. Pacific. So I'm Sam Mason. I am a facilitator with Kearns and West, and I'll be working to facilitate these meetings moving forward alongside the Department of State Land staff, and I'm joined by my colleague Maria, who's supporting the meeting and taking notes. Just a reminder, you should have seen that notification here. This meeting is being recorded and will be shared on DSL's webpage. Today's meeting will begin to focus on the mitigation section of the rules and provide background information to support the RAC's future discussions. We'll be looking to RAC members to engage in this meeting, so please ask your questions, provide comments, and for our non-RAC members who are here as interested parties, we'll have time for your comments later in the agenda. And we ask that you remain on mute and in listening mode for this meeting. So before we dive into the agenda for today, just wanted to do a quick round of introductions. So first want to start with the DSL team. So if you could provide your name and role on the project, and then we'll move to RAC members to share your name and affiliation, and then on to our agency advisors. So Mel, would you like to get us started?
Sure. Hi, thank you guys for being here. My name is Mel Rodenko. I'm the Mitigation Policy Specialist at DSL. My counterpart, Gray, may be known to some of you as well. They won't be able to join us today, but they're the other mitigation specialists here at DSL.
Great. Next, let's go to Daniel.
Daniel or Danielle?
Daniel.
Okay, sorry. Hi everyone, Danielle Boudreau here. I am the department's rulemaking coordinator. So my main role here is as project manager for the rulemaking process.
Great. Next, let's go to Charles.
Hi, I'm Charles Redon, the removal fill specialist, and I'll mostly be monitoring the chat today. So if you have questions that you don't want to interrupt, you can pop them in there and I'll bring them up when we can.
Great. And next, let's go to Daniel Evans.
Good morning. I'm Daniel Evans. I'm the Wetland Ecology Specialist at DSL. I'm going to be staying off screen today as I presented at the last RAC. I don't have any portions today, but I am available here and listening if anything should arise.
Great. Thank you. All right. Next, let's turn to our RAC members. If you could just share your name and affiliation, that would be great. So I'll start with Becky Craig.
Mute. Hi, I'm Becky Craig, and I'm with the Wetland Conservancy.
Great. Next, let's go to Brad, and then Brian will be on deck.
Good morning, everybody. My name is Brad Livingston. I'm the statewide wetlands program lead for the Oregon Department of Transportation.
Brian, over to you.
Good morning, Brian Cook with Clean Water Services.
Welcome. Next, let's go to Emily, and then Jesse will be on, Jonas will be on deck.
Hey, good morning. I'm Emily Elcott. I'm a riparian ecologist and geomorphologist with Interfluve.
Hello, Jonas Moyal, wetland scientist, mitigation specialist with Green Banks LLC.
Great, welcome. Next, let's go to Caitlin, and then Sue will be on deck.
Caitlin just made a comment that she is having technical difficulties.
Okay, great. Thanks for catching that. Let's go to Sue then.
I'm Sue Brady. I'm with Anderson Perry & Associates.
Great. Next, let's go to Julia.
Hi, folks. My name is Julia Bond, and I'm with the City of Portland's Bureau of Environmental Services, and I work closely with Caitlin Lovell. She asked me to join for some of the more technical aspects of this work.
Okay, great. Welcome. And did I miss anyone who is sitting in as an alternate for today's conversation?
I'm Melissa Brown, and Melissa Brown. I'm with Bureau of Environmental Services. I work with Julia and Caitlin, and I am a fish biologist and watershed ecologist.
Great, welcome. Okay, and so now we want to invite our other agency partners to share your name and affiliation as well. So first I'll look to Shelley.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Shelley Tatum with the Oregon Department of Environmental Quality, and I'm the acting water quality manager right now. Thank you.
Great, and do we have Joy on the line? I don't see Joy on the line. I think
Joy just reached out to me that she's sick today.
Okay, sorry to hear that. And unfortunately, Andrea is not available for today's meeting either. So I think that covers all of our agency partners. So with that, we can go ahead and take a look at the agenda. All right, so before this meeting, we sent out the agenda, and please let us know if you didn't receive it, just so we can make sure you all have a copy in the future moving forward. So just a little context, at the last meeting, the RAC focused the discussions on permitting and jurisdiction sections of the rules, and it was really helpful to hear the feedback on the proposed changes through the RAC member discussions. Today, we'll start to focus on the mitigation section of the rules by dedicating time for DSL to present on the stream mitigation function-based accounting methodology to ensure we all have shared understanding of what that means, what that looks like. This meeting will really help to tee up discussions at the June meeting, where the agenda will focus on reviewing the proposed rule language for the mitigation section and hearing your comments and feedback on those proposed rule changes as they relate to stream mitigation. So you'll see we'll have a presentation here from Mel with DSL. We'll have time for a break, and then the presentation will continue. And we will also have time held for those interested party comments towards the end of the session today. And we'll wrap up with next steps and adjourn at noon. So we can move on to the next slide. Thank you. Just a reminder to folks to please remain on mute and speak one at a time, just so we can all hear each other and make sure everyone has a chance to participate in the conversation. And so as a reminder for folks, if Zoom's not your primary platform of use, to raise your hand, you can click the reactions button at the bottom of your screen. It looks like a little heart. Click on that, and then you can click raise your hand. Also, if you're on camera, you can raise your hand. I'll be looking out for that as well. If you're joined by phone, you can press *9 to raise your hand and *6 to come off mute. If you have any technical difficulties, please do reach out to Danielle here, who can help support you. Just another note for you all to also be mindful of balancing speaking time. So if you find you're jumping in a lot, we encourage you to take a step back, let others get into the conversation. And if you tend to be more reserved, but you have a question as we go through the presentation, we do encourage you to raise your hand, jump in, and really get engaged as much as you feel comfortable. Just one other thing to note, we have closed captions available for this meeting. So if you would like to activate those, you can go to the bottom of your screen in your toolbar and be able to click on the closed captions. We have chat enabled for this meeting. And so if you have questions, we'll encourage you to vocalize them. If you're not able to, for whatever reason, you can also share your questions and comments in the chat, and we'll have DSL staff ready to address those questions as they come in. And finally, we just ask that all participants be respectful of each other as fellow RAC members, as well as the DSL representatives. So with that, I'll go ahead and transition us into the presentation portion of the meeting. And so Mel will pull up her screens momentarily. And as she does, I just wanted to share a little bit more of kind of framing for this presentation. So Melanie is going to walk through sharing information about the stream mitigation accounting methodology. And this meeting is really focused on information sharing so that everyone has a shared understanding of what that means. And the next meeting will really be more oriented towards discussion and hearing your feedback on line by line of the rules related to the proposed policies and how DSL will be incorporating those into the rule. So this topic may be familiar to some and it may be new to others. And so we just appreciate everyone's patience as we make sure everyone has that common shared understanding. And we hope this will make the discussions on the specific proposed rule changes really productive when we get to that in June. So as we go through, we'll pause for you to ask questions for clarifications. We'll also have a few different Zoom polls in there for you to engage with the presentation. And we'll also plan to take a break around 10:30 for about 15 minutes. So with that, I'll now pass it over to Mel to share the presentation.
Great, thanks, Sam. And thanks for that explanation about how we're going to be handling the topics. One of our goals is to avoid information overload for all of you folks, but also still giving you the time you deserve to process and provide feedback, as well as giving kind of the information the time it deserves. So today, as Sam said, I'm walking you all through the accounting, the stream assessment or stream mitigation accounting methodology. And we'll kind of stop right at the end of that portion where we get through like, this is the whole way that we're going to be calculating how much mitigation is required or being provided. And that means that we kind of split the parts of that are outside of accounting into the next meeting as well. As we were developing the presentation, we realized that some of those policies for special circumstances need to be presented in that next meeting. And those, you've probably already seen some of that in the rule language if you've reviewed it. So I know folks are interested in commenting on some of those. So apologies if you were really ready to make comments this time around. We can hopefully have time for that this time as well as next time when you're looking at, and what I mean by the special circumstances. So you know, our in-kind replacement, our threshold for using these policy or these protocols, as well as that stream bed hardening piece that we have in the rules. So we'll be focusing in on those and the rule language next time. But before I jump into our accounting protocols and take you step by step through the different pieces of that, I thought it was important to provide some background information on how we developed this, who was involved, and also on our stream function assessment method, because it's kind of important to know some pieces of that to understand some decisions we made. So rolling into that, the first background information that I wanted to provide you folks is kind of starting with why, explaining why we're trying to make these program improvements. And it's really twofold, the reasons that we're trying to improve mitigation. One is that the laws in Oregon, and I'm going to share some of that language in a minute, but the laws here direct us to be replacing functions and values of water resources rather than just, an area, footprint, things like that. And the reason our laws do that is because the functions of those water resources is why we have the laws. We as a society have decided that the functions that water provide us, clean water, transportation, all these different things that we get from our water resources are really important to our society. So they need to be replaced when they're lost or impacted. So that's kind of the one part of why, but then the other part of why we're making these changes is because it's been recognized that our program as it stands today isn't and really can't be consistent in what we require for replacing those functions. I'll dive into the nitty-gritty whys of that when I talk about how we currently handle mitigation. But first, I wanted to present those concepts from law that I mentioned. And I like sharing this quote from the removal of fill law because it lists, well, it doesn't specifically call out, these are water functions that we value. It is actually listing a variety of functions that waters of the state are providing. and explaining that these reasons are why we're regulating the removal fill in those waters. So it's talking about just having water, having clean water, using it for our commerce and navigation, but also it gets at human health and safety and our economy, recreation, and of course, fish and fishing being important things as well. So those are all actually called out in law. This is a direct quote, and I have the citation at the bottom. So right away, when we just explain what the removal fill law is and why we have it, we're talking about aquatic resource functions. And then this is just a beautiful statement from Oregon statute. And I think it really shows that as Oregonians, we really think of water more than just, a static, inanimate landscape feature. And so in statute, we state that water resources include not just the water itself, but the aquatic life and the habitats therein and all other natural resources in and under waters of the state. And again, I think that's really a beautiful thing to have in statute, and it shows recognition of just how vital water resources are for all living things, including us. And then the last piece of statute that kind of explains the why from our law is in how mitigation is explained or defined in law. And what's nice about that is that we don't just kind of lay out like methods of mitigation, creating wetlands somewhere or remeandering a stream, but we actually state that mitigation is really about replacing the functions and values of the water resources. So statute is directing us to a mitigation policy that really focuses us on that why we're protecting and preserving these aquatic resources. And the reason, again, is because we're valuing these functions. And we can maintain those functions through that mitigation step. We have already been able to incorporate the replacement of wetland functions and values into our removal fill program. That was done back in 2018 with the last time we did Division 85 rulemaking. And now this is the next step, what we're doing with you guys now to incorporate that functional replacement for streams to get the kind of the more holistic approach to making sure that our mitigation in Oregon is preserving those functions and values of waters of the state. Before I move on, I did want to make sure that we kind of have a shared understanding of the definitions of these words I'm using. Function, super common word, value, very common word. They have a really specific meaning in the removal fill program. And that's why I wanted to pop this slide up and talk about those definitions. So functions are they're processes that create and support aquatic ecosystems. So something that's measurable and science-based, very objective. There's physical characteristics, biological characteristics of those resources that can be measured. Whereas values are more about like benefits, to the ecological benefits, our social and societal benefits that the ecosystems are providing us. So that's, of course, really subjective and contextual. Where a resource is located, in a watershed or in a basin can affect how it's valued. And our values change over time, just with society's priorities and understandings. And sometimes programs can be a little dismissive of values, but they really are critical, just as critical as understanding the functions because of that watershed piece, that context of understanding how important something is relative to where it is, and understanding, trade-offs that we might need to make in our regulatory decisions. And so now I wanted to have Danielle share a Zoom poll, and we're going to use a couple of Zoom polls today. I think we have 4 in total. And to help us understand where you folks are at for different topics. So for this topic, we're really wanting to know if these definitions for functions and values are something that you're used to. So if you guys want to go ahead and pop an answer into this poll, we'll be able to share the results in a minute.
Okay, it looks like the majority of people have responded, so I'm going to go ahead and end the poll
Okay.
and share the results.
Okay. This is great. Wonderful. So it looks like this wasn't a new concept for anyone, which is really great. That's very helpful since this is sort of the foundational piece of what we're going to be talking about today. And for folks that, are just a little bit familiar with it, I'd be happy to talk about it more if you're interested during one of our office hours, or answer any questions as we move through the process today. Okay. I think we can go ahead and stop sharing. I probably need to close it as well. All right. So if there's no questions at this point on the background information I've presented so far, I was going to move into how we currently handle stream mitigation. Okay. So currently we have half, I would say, of our stream mitigation policies in rule. And the half that we have in rule, we were able to add when we added our wetland updates the last time, well, some pieces of it. And that half is the eligibility piece. And how I think about that is basically how we explain what kind of mitigation we're asking people to provide when they're impacting a stream. And this is pretty consistent with how we handle it for wetlands as far as the eligibility. So for a stream, when a mitigation project is a match or eligible for replacing lost functions or impacts at a impact site, the mitigation needs to be in the same fourth field watershed or HUC, so same watershed scale, or so within the same watershed at that scale as the impacts. You have to look at the group level functions. So this is basically matching functions, but at a broader scale. Having the same flow permanence, maybe intermittent streams matched with intermittent, perennial matched with perennial. Stream size, which is actually to do with flow, and we'll get deeper into that in a minute, and then ESH status. And so how that relates back to wetlands for folks that are more familiar, it is consistent, but for wetland, as far as the location, the fourth field HUC, but for the type matching with wetlands, that's where we get into the HGM and Cowarden classifications, in addition to the group ratings, which is the same with stream. And of course, for both wetlands and stream, we do have out of kind pathways and a requirement for our really rare resources to be replaced in kind. And I'll just note, we'll talk more about this later. We are proposing to drop one of these eligibility requirements because it wouldn't be needed after we implemented our function-based accounting, and that's the group level matching. And it'll probably become more clear why we're dropping that. And oh, I see I use an abbreviation without defining it. Daniel, maybe we can even fix that on the slides before we publish them to the website. ESH, thank you for asking that question. ESH stands for Essential Salmonid Habitat. So there's a really wonderful mapping that's done, that's published online through our agency and with coordination with ODFW, that shows the different status of streams. So impacts to a stream that is listed as essential salmonid habitat would need to be replaced with mitigation. That is also essential salmonid habitat. So thank you for that question. Are there any others? This is the eligibility. We'll talk about accounting in a second. So this is currently what we're requiring. Okay, wonderful. So for accounting, this is like the other half of the figuring out what type of mitigation and how much. So we say it almost as like a first step, second step process. So the eligibility step determines if you've got the right kind of mitigation, and then the accounting step is how you figure out how much mitigation you need to provide. So again, folks familiar with wetlands know that we use like a base ratio depending on what method of mitigation you're doing, creation, restoration, enhancement, preservation. And then we adjust that amount based on how much functions are being replaced and what types of vegetation are being impacted at the impact site. But for streams, there's not an established ratio or an accounting method. It's all case by case. And so this is kind of the other part of why we're making these changes. The fact that we don't have anything established for streams right now, it creates inconsistencies. It's just very difficult to know how much mitigation to ask for, to know what's appropriate. And it's the reason we're in this rulemaking process right now. And I'm ready to move to some more background information to tell you kind of the development process, if there aren't any questions on how we're currently requiring stream mitigation. Okay. So it was a long development process to get this methodology. And I'm going to talk to you about what the process looked like and who was involved. But I want you all to know that it took the team a lot of time and contemplation to develop these concepts. So if you need a little time to reflect on them and come back with questions, come to an office hours, come to the next meeting, reach out separately to have a conversation with me or one of my colleagues, that's all totally understandable. Happy to help you guys with that. Because again, we've had a lot of time to sit with this information and find good ways to present it. And hopefully you'll be able to follow us through that. So it's been a long and iterative process to get here. And you'll notice that the timeline starts back in 2009. That was a couple years before I started with the agency. So it's been a long process. Basically what happened quite a while ago was that predecessors at DSL and the Army Corps of Engineers and EPA were looking at some studies that had come out from the Natural Resource Council, looking at mitigation programs and identifying issues. And we noticed, or they recognized, that there were problems in Oregon. And those problems were that one, wetland acreage was being replaced, but not functions in most cases. And then mitigation for anything other than wetlands, like streams, was just not consistent. And so recognizing those problems, they went about making improvements. And so that's what this timeline is showing. It's showing how we had to create a stream function assessment from scratch, that we had to take our wetland function assessment and really refine it, normalize it, make it consistent. And then we had to do rulemaking to use that wetland assessment to do function-based accounting for wetlands, to adopt the use of our stream functional assessment into our regulatory program. And so that was what we did back in 2018, 2019, the last time, again, we had Division 85 rulemaking was doing that process. And so now this time is the kind of the last thing on our slide here, where we're trying to adopt the stream. And what happened between those points when we adopted wetland mitigation and function-based accounting into rule, and now when we're trying to do the same for streams, was a lot of technical developments. We worked with a technical advisory committee of regional experts. And we had an interagency team that worked through each piece of the accounting methodology to determine what would be appropriate and to test those out. And some people often ask when we get to this point, why didn't we just do the same thing for wetlands and streams? Totally valid question. And we tried. But the challenge is not just that streams are functionally different and that we didn't really have the same shared language with streams that we do for wetlands, but the impacts to streams themselves are actually quite different. So what I mean by that, as an example with wetlands, when you apply for a permit to do a development where wetlands currently exist, typically you then fill the wetlands with foundational material and then build a structure on top, and that wetland is no longer there. So the mitigation needs to provide that area of wetland and the functions the wetland was providing. Whereas with streams, they're typically a partial impact, meaning that we kind of change streams. We don't typically remove them from the landscape like we do wetlands. And we can change streams in lots of ways. We can improve them, or we can degrade them. We can move them to a different place on the landscape, slow them down, we can speed them up, all with physical changes. We can make them really simple structurally, you know, by removing meanders, removing riffles and wood, or we can make them more complex by adding those things back in. But in each of those cases, typically it's still a stream after the project is done. Its function, how it's functioning has changed a lot, but that stream still exists. And I don't have a picture of it here, but a great example for anyone who's familiar, really close to home, is in Eugene. And there's lots of streams like this all over the country and the world, but there's a stream in Eugene, part of Amazon Creek, that is channelized with 90-degree walls and bed that's concrete. And now they've been removing that concrete and recontouring the banks. And you can see it from the road next to it. It's beautiful. And so it was a stream before it was put into that concrete. It was a stream after it was put into that concrete. And it's still a stream when they removed it. But it had very different sets of functions at each of those 3 stages. And as that restoration matures, the functions will continue to change. So that makes quantifying the losses and gains of functions over time really hard. And that's why it was challenging for us to come up with a methodology that could try and tease out those differences. So we were really being fair and appropriate when determining how much mitigation was either required for an impact or being provided by a mitigation project. And so now I just wanted to move on to explain who was involved in the development of those pieces of our accounting. And the first folks that we got involved was our Technical Advisory Committee, or TAC. And this was with the support of some facilitation funding that we got from the EPA. We were able to pull together this committee of technical experts to have them review and provide feedback on different key concepts of the plans we had for our mitigation accounting program. And these folks committed so much time to this process. We were really, really grateful for the help. We had 7 2-hour meetings with them, and they were virtual. This was kind of right at the beginning of everything becoming virtual in 2020. And we even had them doing additional background work and diving into the subjects between meetings. So I definitely want to thank all of these folks. And some of you are here on the call today, and I'm really grateful for your involvement because it significantly improved the outcomes for our program. And some of the things that the TAC, or the Technical Advisory Committee, reviewed and provided us feedback on were, we looked at our stream functional assessment method, looking at the information that we get from it, the scores for functions and values, and how we could incorporate that into accounting methods, if all the information should be included or not, and looking at how we could use it to understand those changes that I was talking about before that a stream goes through from a project. We looked at different unit of measure options and got a lot of feedback from them on what we should test out. And when I say unit of measure, it's a way of like quantifying a stream area. Because again, it's different than wetlands when we just do an area footprint. Since the stream still exists, and there are stream area and lengths and all these other features that we could try and use to quantify how much mitigation is there or is needed. And then we also actually worked with them on stream performance standards and monitoring. Now, that is a piece of our program that isn't in rule. It's not an appropriate place to put that kind of policy in rule, because it needs to grow and adapt, and it can't be, you know, the exact same thing for every single permit. So those, that will be more in the form of guidance that will be provided through our website in future, so that we can get more consistency and better results. So that is the work that we did with our TAC. And then I wanted to also introduce our development team to folks. And the reason I really want to stress this is because, as you folks know, in Oregon, we have 2 different agencies that can regulate waters through a permitting process. well, we actually have more than that, but for like the removal fill piece for waters of the state and waters of the US, we have the Corps and then DSL, who are both providing those permits. And so we had an interagency development team to work on all these pieces. We had folks from the US Army Corps of Engineers, from the EPA, and from DSL all working together on each piece. And we used this approach because we wanted all of the work we did, all of the results, the methodologies to be acceptable for each agency, so that we would have good customer service. It wouldn't be, you know, DSL asking for one thing and the Corps asking for something else. And this made it a little challenging. We did have to go kind of slow in through the development process because as each part of the policy or methodology was developed, we had to bring that to agency leadership from all three agencies, provide them what we developed, the alternatives we looked at, explain why, and get their approval on any recommendation our team was bringing forward. So as I walk you guys through the different pieces of what we're trying to introduce, that's what we were providing each time to agency leadership to get approval. And we did, for each piece, get approval from all three agencies to bring forward. So that should hopefully provide a lot more consistency and better customer service in future. And for the next section, I'm going to be talking more about our functional assessment, kind of shifting from what happened in the past and who was involved. So if anybody has questions about that process, I'd be happy to answer those. Okay. So SFAM is a term that some folks may have heard tossed around. It's an acronym for our functional assessment for streams. So SFAM meaning the Stream Functional Assessment Method. Excuse me. And this is something we had to develop from the ground up. That was on that timeline I showed you folks. We didn't have anything that was being used in Oregon, and there wasn't anything nationwide that we could just easily borrow and apply in Oregon. And our team, some of the folks you saw on the last slide were involved in that development. So Tracy Nadeau from EPA, Dana Hicks from DSL, and then we also had Rob Colombe, who was a contractor with EPA, and they did a fantastic job developing SFAM. And it is a rapid, we call it a level 2 or rapid functional assessment method. And when we say rapid, we mean for a field assessment rapid. It still does take some time to complete it, but it's considerably more rapid than a level 3 assessment, which is far more in depth and long term. And so we also made sure that it was done in a way that could be very repeatable, so that we would have consistent results. That was really important to us. And what it can repeatedly do when users apply it correctly is it can quantify functions and values, meaning it puts a numeric score from 0 to 10 on a stream function and on how it's valued. It does that by collecting stream data, both in the field, like is pictured on the slide. Those are our users at a training, collecting field data, as well as in the office using some mapping resources and some like remote data through a GIS interface that we provide. So again, this image is illustrating that direct data measurement. And that's a kind of key piece to understand how it's being used and what it can actually measure, is that field, that non-invasive data collection that we do. So currently we're using SFAM, or the Stream Functional Assessment Method, in Oregon on non-tidal and wadable rivers and streams. So wadable because right now we need to get into the stream to collect the data. And we're currently requiring SFAM be turned in as part of any individual permit package or permit application that is proposing permanent negative impacts to a stream. So if it's temporary impacts, it's not required, and we don't require it for some of our other authorizations like general authorizations, which are commonly done for a lot of restoration projects, for example. And that's for permits when an SFAM can be done. So when it's waivable and non-title. When it's not waivable or it's title, or for some other reason SFAM doesn't apply, applicants use what we call a BPJ, or best professional judgment approach. They assess the same stream functions that SFAM assesses, but they just provide a rating, meaning like low, medium, or high for those functions based on their evaluations of the site and their own professional judgment. And again, currently we're using it for non-title and waivable, but some of the good news is that our partners up in Washington are further developing the method for collecting data when you can't wade into the stream. So kind of for like non-wadeable streams, as well as approaches for like large rivers. There's some technical challenges to a very large river, and so they're working on developing those. And so once those are fully developed, we'll be able to simply adopt those into the SFAM tool through like a re-release of a new version. So we're excited about that opportunity. And it might surprise some folks that Washington's doing that work. We started some of it, they're carrying it forward. It is a tool that is relevant for all Pacific Northwest streams based on the EPA data sets that were used to develop the scoring. Our mapping tool that we use for the office portion would need to be customized for the state, because ours is just providing Oregon data. But that's a more simple step than developing a whole new tool from scratch. So that's one nice feature of SFAM as well, is that kind of regional applicability. So to understand why the development team made recommendations and decisions that we did, it's important to understand or to explain to you folks the setup of SFAM, so that you have a picture of what data is being collected in the field, and because that data then creates those function scores. It's used in a scoring model, in a formula, to create that function score. And since stream functions, they occur on different scales, you know, locally to a project as well as up and downstream, we actually have different scales of the assessment to reflect that. And so that's what these pictures are trying to illustrate. The picture with the green riparian area is showing kind of the smaller assessment piece, where we have a project area and a proximal assessment area. So you're collecting data up in the riparian area, on the stream banks. So that includes like some perpendicular data. And then we also collect data up and downstream of where the actual project is happening. And that that data is you're down in the stream collecting that data. But one of the important things to know about how we set those up is that we scale the size of those assessment areas based on the width of the stream, which helps us to make it applicable to different size streams. So what I'm showing here is that we've taken the BFW, means bankful width. So like at the high water mark, you take the bankful width in a few different places and average it, and you use that width, so the size of the stream, to determine how far upstream and downstream you'll be collecting data, how far away from the stream you'll be collecting data, you know, out in this riparian area. And of course, the project area is also defines that. So we have this extent here where the more in-depth is collected. So it's scaled to the size of the stream by using the average bankful width, that ordinary high water. And that defines the limits of the assessment as well as scaling it. So what we're getting is then assessment areas that include riparian areas, floodplain areas. We'll be able to show the vegetated riparian corridor. Information collected in there includes like woody vegetation, what's invasive, if there's very large trees. And then down in the stream, when we also collect, I'm sorry, before I get down the stream, we collect some data on like things that are limiting the stream from moving, such as infrastructure being built next to it. We collect data on hardened stream banks, and then down inside the stream, we're collecting data on basically the variation or diversity of the features inside the stream channel. And that informs quite a few stream functions. And again, non-tidal wadable streams is the current use, but in future it will be able to be used on still non-tidal, but larger streams and rivers. Tidal assessment will be something that will take some separate funds to develop so that we can incorporate additional functions that you find in tidal streams that you don't necessarily find in non-tidal. And so what I wanted to point out before moving on to more detail about the functions we're measuring is that we can't just directly measure a function like in this rapid and consistent way that would make it work for a regulatory program. I mean, you can go out and do a scientific study and directly measure functions, but we needed something that could be done over and over again and quickly for our program to work. So to do that, we had to measure something that informs stream functions, that is recognized, you know, that we have data to confirm that these things that can be measurable do inform functions. And so we call those measures. Very creative, right? It's measurable, so we call them measures. But we wanted to make sure these were things that we could actually quantify, we could rapidly measure, repeatedly measure, and that would be sensitive to change over time, because that's really important with SFAM, is to be able to evaluate that change. So some examples I have here on the slide is we can measure the incision of a channel, the variability of a channel bed, or the amount of wood in a stream. And those can all inform different functions that can tell you more about, hyporheic exchange or sediment continuity or connection to the floodplain. These are all things that can be informed through these measures. But this approach also means that there are some limitations on what can be quantified with SFAM, because we're measuring like the observable features kind of at the surface level. You see this great picture of Pete standing in Pringle Creek. He's able to measure where the stones in the bottom of the creek lay and how much sediment there is and how much water is above them. But he can't really get more information about what's below them, what kind of hyporheic exchange is happening, maybe connections to groundwater. And even above, when he's up in the riparian area, we try and do our best to get sort of to illustrate that layered dynamic that you get in a riparian area, but there's still a little more complexity than can be easily quantified with these measures. So there are some limits, and we had to come up with some additional policies that we'll talk about at the next RAC to address some of those limitations. Any questions before I move on to the specific functions that SFAM measures? Okay. So there are 11 different functions that SFAM provides a function and value score on a range of 0 to 10 for. That's what we call SFAM outputs. It's basically the scores. So we have a group of hydrologic functions, water quality functions, geomorphic functions, and biological functions. So each one on here that's listed with a dash is one of the functions that we get a numeric score for. We also are provided a rating, sort of a low, medium, high, or what it actually says is lower, moderate, or higher. And that just kind of helps you compare and contrast how that score really ranges, so that we wouldn't get hung up on the difference of a few decimal points if they're both moderate scores, for example. It just kind of helps you better understand what the scores are saying. And one of the nice things about these function scores is that the SFAM is just assessing them as defined or as they exist. Some functional assessments found in other parts of the country really look at make prior assumptions about what stream reaches could actually provide rather than what they are providing. So we thought that was an important distinguishing feature for SFAM. And then another lovely feature of SFAM that is very useful for the regulatory program is that it is very sensitive to small changes. And that has to do with how we're collecting the data and the amount of data that gets collected. And we've tested this many times. So small amounts of scores can increase, or small amounts of stream change can increase the scores. And usually the amount it changes, it is relative to the amount of change you see at the stream. And a good example of that is a stream that we've been using repeatedly for training that has had ongoing erosion. And from one year to another, the scores that the functional scores, sediment continuity, and sediment mobility are being affected a little by that increased erosion. But when we compare the score from 5 years ago to now, we see a big change. So it's actually that sensitive of a tool, which is really useful. But what we can also do with that is create a predicted score for after a project happens. And that's really useful for the permitting process. And so this is done during the planning phase. It can also be done later on as part of monitoring, but what we currently require and will continue to require is sort of you take your assessment that you complete in the field, and then you follow the instructions we provided in the user's manual or the information you were given during SFAM trainings, because we're now starting to train people on how to do predicted assessments, and you adjust that baseline assessment based off of the project you're planning, so that you understand how your project will change the existing functions and values. And that could be a mitigation project that is increasing a lot of the functions, or it could be an impact project that could be reducing some of the functions that are found at the site. And then that difference, that gain and that loss, is what we can then use in mitigation accounting. And I have an example of that on the next slide, if there aren't any questions on using SFAM predictively. Okay. So in this example, we can see that a project has let me come over here. The project has this baseline set of scores. So a person in the office and in the field collected data on all the different measures that SFAM has, and that produced this set of function scores. And then they were able to go in and make the adjustments as the guidance directs to come up with a set of predicted scores after their project. What we're proposing folks do, and that's part of the rulemaking that we're doing right now, is we're proposing them to do this predicted function score on a 10-year post-project basis. So kind of a not super short, but a measured timeline that folks will use to understand the change that will happen. And having this predicted function score really helps us as an agency understand what functions are being changed by a project, some that are being negatively impacted and some that are being positively impacted. You'll see that both of those in this example. And this really, can also identify when a project is kind of balancing itself out, having gains and losses, that maybe mitigation wouldn't actually be required because of the beneficial things that are also being done. Sometimes people refer to that as self-mitigating. So those are all things that can be measured through this process. Can't tell if a hand went up. We do have a poll, but I think we'll hold off to see if there's any questions first.
This is Julia Bond. I was just going to confirm. So you said it's a 10-year prediction, and so that would be things like expectation of changes in the plant community, tree growth happening, because I see like thermal regulation in this example goes to nothing, right? So, but in another example, you would be planting trees and expecting those to grow over the course of that 10 years. Same thing with like invasive species management and predicting what that site would look like. I assume that also means that there needs to be kind of an O&M plan associated with, if say it's a restoration project, to kind of know that 10 years from now that site would indeed continue to function as predicted for 10 years from now, if that was a part of that as well.
An O&M plan, is that
like the
adaptive
idea,
management?
so yes, right. So the idea that if you're going to predict that invasive species management is going to continue to happen at that site, because I would assume that goes into, say, like an improved vegetation score that you would get within your riparian zone. You can only really guarantee that that's going to be the case if you have a commitment to that site for that 10-year time period.
Yes, that's a wonderful question. And we do have monitoring requirements and performance requirements for any site that is being considered mitigation. So what I know we will end up having with our stream mitigation is this bottom category of projects that integrate both impacts that are negative and mitigation actions. So yes, at those as well as at mitigation projects, there are monitoring requirements to make sure that those actions that were planned, such as invasive species management or like making sure that the trees that were planted survive. Yes, we have those. And yes, you mentioned the 10-year timeline. We wanted to have it far enough out that people aren't being negatively dinged for that temporary conditions that exist right after like a restoration action. Sites can look pretty rough right away.
Absolutely. Yeah, they don't look great the year after they're
so we wanted
constructed.
to bump it out enough that we were kind of past that, and the site was not like where it'll be in 30 years, but in pretty good shape is what we were thinking.
Okay, and you'll have to remind me, since it's been a little bit since I've last looked at some of the guidance. Is there guidance within the SFAM materials on sort of how to predict certain things, like, say, for example, tree growth, and how, because a 10-year-old tree doesn't necessarily look like a 30 or 40-year-old tree. Is there specific guidance on how folks should be predicting these future scores 10 years from now for the different functions?
There is some guidance in the end of the manual that's focused more on what functions to adjust for certain project actions. I will say that is part of the manual that we will continue to develop and beef up over time, because that's a very good idea. What you just mentioned, I need to remember that, the idea of like just how much to expect from a tree over time and how to change that. So that's a very good question. There is guidance provided that will continue to be improved, and we have started including that in the SFAM training. And I think what we'll likely need to do is also provide additional guidance as an agency, like within some of our removal fill guides that complements that SFAM manual is what I think we'll probably need to do.
Okay, thank you. I appreciate the input.
Yeah.
And Charles, I saw your hand go up. Did you have another clarification on that point?
I had a question for Melody. Someone was asking in the chat about SFAM latest versions. And so I notice our website has the current workbook that lists some of the changes for 2.0, but the later references still say 1.0 or 1.1. So do you know if we have all of the versioning current on the website or not?
It is.
Okay.
Within our website, the format now has those menus that expand when you click on them. And the link for SFAM, the workbook and the manual, I believe is sort of embedded in the language, like in the paragraph. And then below it, there are links to the old versions. And sometimes that will confuse folks because they want to jump to the link because they know what they need. When the link they're looking for is actually up in the text.
Okay.
Yeah.
I can screen share that in a minute, but I see Jonas also had a question, so
Okay.
Yeah.
let him go.
Yeah, thank you. So getting back to this 10-year, looking at a function in 10 years, I realize that this discussion is sort of a general one for all sorts of SFAM analyses. But from a mitigation, if we're doing a long-term mitigation project or mitigation bank that has a long-term protection mechanism, we have an understanding that stuff like trees will reach maximum height, we would assume. And so I see how the 10-year mark is a great, we've done some predictive stream SFAMs at the 10-year mark, and I think that's a great mark for a lot of these functions. But again, being dinged, like if it's got a long-term plan for something like thermal regulation, may not make a lot of sense when we know it's something that is going to be protected indefinitely and has a budget for maintenance for forever. So just to mention that, I know with some of our mitigation banks, even with ORWAP, we've gone back and forth a little with DSL about, look, this is going to be a protected site forever, so let's not assume our trees never get tall. So yeah, just to I don't know if there's anywhere to clarify that for mitigation banking or not.
Yeah,
but
I mean, great point, Jonas. I totally see where you're coming from and agree with you that that protection makes a difference. And we've addressed that in a couple ways. We did put this 10-year timeline concept into rule, but we used a statement that basically says 10 years generally, unless the department directs you to do something else. And so banking, like you're talking about, would be one of those scenarios where we could look at a different one. Two other things that we've done that will help in the scenario you mentioned. When we get to sort of the end of the methodology, the last piece of accounting that we're going to talk about is adjustments. So that's where you increase or decrease the amount of mitigation. One of those is for vegetation. And what you'll notice, and I'll restate this and enforce this later, we don't ding a mitigation site for like planting trees and the fact that it'll take time to develop. We don't adjust down. That adjustment's only applied on the impact side, which is what we also do for wetlands. And then the other piece for adjustments is we have an increase in how much mitigation can be provided by a site when it has that long-term protection. And so I've got some, even a math slide that'll show that later. So we'll come back to your question, but thank you for bringing it up because that is very, very valid. And as I said, we do include that statement that 10 years, I would say 10 years is sort of our standard permitting approach. And then for certain scenarios, we could adjust it. Trees that we know are slow to develop. I can't think of other things right off the top of my head, but as you said, trees that are slow to develop could be a scenario where we say like, adjust those scores based on the matured canopy, for example.
yeah, thank you for clarifying. I mean, one other thing that comes to mind for mitigation is if we're calculating the total number of credits based on our prediction, and then we get to year 10 and we do SFAM, and we get different scores than the predicted scores. And we sold all these credits based on the calculator. Now we're, adjusting the credit prediction way down the road. So I guess there may be more complexity here for mitigation banking. I'm guessing.
I think there will be complexities.
10
like
years
that
a long
as
way.
we go. We don't have an example of that at this point. We may need to roll out some integration of credit release schedules into it. What I would hope is that if we look like we're not going to be hitting a mark, and this would be for banking or permittee responsible mitigation, when we see that a site isn't maybe going to be hitting a goal that was set, coming in with that adaptive management that I think it was Julia brought up, and making those changes is I hope what could then happen to try and redirect towards the end goal of certain functions. Yeah.
Okay.
And
Yeah, thank you.
yeah, I scrolled on the wrong screen. Where were we? Here we are. So I do have another poll. If there aren't any other questions, this poll is for us to get a better understanding of how SFAM relates to your work.
Okay, it looks like the majority of folks have answered, so I'm going to go ahead and end the poll and share the results.
Thank you, Danielle. Okay. Okay. Yeah, that's great. It sounds like most folks are either using it or understanding it. It's relating. So I'm glad this was useful information for most folks, and that this is a tool that is part of the work you guys are doing. Okay, great. So the next step is to start getting into our actual accounting methods. Now that we kind of have that background info on what our development process was and on how SFAM works. So before I talk about the details of the pieces, I just want to admire that photo for a minute. What a nice photo. Okay, sorry. I'm going to harken back to earlier when I mentioned eligibility and accounting, and how this is sort of a two-step process for mitigation. And I always like to simplify it to eligibility is all about the question of what kind of mitigation do I need to provide? And accounting is all about answering the question of how much mitigation do I need to provide? Or if you flip that, like, does my site provide for other people, if you're coming from the banking point of view? And so when I explained our current process before, that's what we have on the left side of the screen here. And this is kind of showing a flow of approval and how there is like an out of kind watershed priority option. That piece isn't changing. We'll still have out of kind options. We're still going to have the ecological match steps. What you will notice down here and what defines an ecological match is we're proposing, and you'll see this in the draft rule language when we look at it next month, is not using the group level matching. If you remember when we looked at the SFAM functions, there was like the hydrologic group and the geomorphic group and the biological group. And so what SFAM does is kind of give you an overall highest ranking from those groups, to kind of give you a vibe for how the stream is functioning. We don't want to continue requiring that level of matching because we could be asking folks to then mitigate for functions that are not being affected by their project, and that just wouldn't be fair. And so we can drop that piece. We no longer need it essentially, and it wouldn't really be fair to keep it. One other thing you'll notice in our rule changes related to ecological match is that this piece on stream size, we are adding some detail to that part of rule because it previously just referenced administrative rules that the Department of Forestry has, where they define what's meant by a small stream, medium stream, or a large stream. And that I felt like added confusion, and well, I think everyone kind of was agreeing with that. So we're adding that detail into our rule because what they actually mean is about flow size. Rather than, it's not like about a width of stream, it's about how much flow is in that stream. And it's still a mapped layer. but we just wanted that extra definition in our rule. But I wanted to also share this slide before we get into the specifics of step 2, the accounting, because it's good to remind you that accounting, like this math that we're going to do to find out how much mitigation needs to be provided, doesn't actually have to include decisions that are already made. So where the mitigation should be, is it the right kind of mitigation? So we've already made those kinds of decisions in the eligibility step. So really in accounting, all we have to get down to is a simple math to find out debits or credits, meaning gains or losses. Are you providing a certain surplus of mitigation, or do you need to provide more, or does your project require more? That's really the piece that's left that we need to go into now. And so this is kind of blowing up that second step 2 to explain the kind of overview of the components of that answer, that number of credits or debits. And so those foundational components work together to create that result. And so that's using the SFAM scores or outputs, so the function scores and the value scores, because the function scores are quantifying that change in function. Remember I showed before, like you can do a existing and a predicted, so there's your change in function. And then the value scores are providing us that watershed information, knowing what's locally important. And then the unit of measure is how we're really adding well, we have the quantification of the quality, but then we're quantifying the amount of quality over a stretch of stream. And then finally, adjustments are how we get other policies incorporated into, or other things that just can't be included in the initial part of the math, into this accounting. And so the formula at the bottom is the math that we do for each individual function. And then we sum all of those up to get the total amount of either mitigation being provided or mitigation that's needed. And so this formula is basically the number of credits or debits, so amount of mitigation, is where we take the difference in function, we weight it by how valued that function is, multiply it by a unit of measure, so size of the project, and then modify it with adjustments. That's what that formula is saying. And how we're phrasing that in rule is replacement equal to the sum of the SFAM value-weighted function scores multiplied by the impacted channel length. And so we'll talk about all of those things more as we dive deeper into the rule. But I just wanted to bring it up right now as an overview. And I see a hand.
Yeah, Jonas.
Yeah, the next slide will dive into the differences in function scores. So yeah, any questions that come before diving into those details would be great. Yeah.
Yeah, sorry, more questions from me. One thing that's tough when you are making mitigation is the value scores can be rather frustrating because we can't control them. So for example, if we've got a severely eroded stream with all sorts of issues, and there's no gravel mine next door, the value scores are lower than if there's a gravel mine or something, as an example, something that impacts that stream from society. And so one of the questions I've always kind of had about the values is how often is DSL identifying these sources of degradation? Are these being updated? Because they greatly affect what the value, how many credits will be produced based on the calculator here, or you know, I know over time, for example, as urbanization is occurring along some streams, those values for the improvements are going to go up over time. So just curious, like, how do you all figure out the degradation sources? And is it consistent across the state, across streams, watersheds?
Great question. I love this question, Jonas. Thank you. Couple things to talk about with that. Because of how we quantify the values, some of them will be immediately changed by things that happen on the landscape. So for example, when you're answering a question in SFAM that's talking about like development, how wide a riparian or how much development, when that happens, that answer will immediately change. And so that will influence the outcome. When you're using the layers provided in Mapper to answer those questions, a lot of the information that informs values comes from that office portion of completing an SFAM where you're using the map. Mapper itself gets updated every year with the newest version of all the layers. The only layer that we really control updates of is essential salmon habitat. That's the only one DSL really has an active role in. The others get updated by a variety of agencies. So we saw, for example, DEQ recently updated a lot of their mapping for water quality, like for the listed water quality water bodies and streams. And so that information is all now on the Mapper. So when those become available, those get updated each year. So that's really helpful to keep it up to date. And there was one last thing I was going to say on that, and I'm totally blanking on it. Sorry about that. If I think of it later when we're talking about values, I will mention it. But one nice thing about values in our that we'll see in a minute is that they won't reduce the amount of mitigation a site could provide. They'll never like pull back.
Okay.
Yeah, and we'll see that in the map in a minute. Yeah.
And I'm assuming if there's a watershed where a consultant believes that there's more value to a project than being shown in the Mapper, we could probably reach out to DSL and discuss that situation, right? Because I feel like there's so many different reasons for degradation in a watershed, and not sure if DSL or ODFW is going to always have the capacity to analyze those issues and add them to the Mapper.
Absolutely. I completely agree with you. The map tools are wonderful remote tools, but they'll never fully replace, on the ground knowledge of individual locations. So yeah, absolutely.
Thank you.
Great. Caitlin?
I just have a question or clarification. Now, you said that you're no longer using the categories of functions to be able to do the score. Doesn't that... Okay, so if that's true, then there are going to be a lot of instances where you miss functions and you actually don't mitigate for them.
When we dive into the accounting, I'll show how we will, how each function contributes to either the amount of mitigation required or the amount of mitigation being provided. But what I think you might be getting at is this concept of trade-offs.
Yeah.
Where sometimes you're losing a function and replacing it with a different function. Yes, we'll talk a lot more about trade-offs. Some of that will come up next month. Our TAC had a lot of opinions about trade-offs and when they would be okay and when they wouldn't. And so we've tried to find a middle ground where our policies will allow for some trade-offs because it's just necessary for a regulatory program where you can make small gains, let's say in flow variation, but maybe you lost some sediment mobility function. But we wanted to put boundaries on that. And so one of the policies that we'll talk about next month is requiring in-kind replacement for highly valued functions that have, a significant amount of loss. And not to leave you hanging, what we're going to do for that, we're going to say high is just defined in SFAM as like a score of 7 above. So when something has that high value, we look at how much function was lost. And if the amount of function was lost was 1 or more, like a 1 or more points, we require in-kind replacement of that function is what we'll be doing going forward. Otherwise, when things have a lower value score than 7 or less loss than like 1 point, those could be traded off between the different functions.
So I'll just flag two concerns. One is that incentivizes using best professional judgment to minimize the score and therefore not replace those functions and get the lowest score possible, which is always a risk anyways, but this it incentivizes doing that even more. And the other is that the ESH only accounts for spawning habitat. It doesn't account for rearing and foraging habitat. So you're missing a lot of functions that potentially put DSL's mitigation functions at odds with other regulatory drivers that also have to be met. So one of my goals is to try to bring multiple regulatory drivers together to get consistency and companionship across them. And those are two issues where I see some significant daylight.
Those are great comments. We have this recorded, so we'll be able to go back and note them because I didn't get a chance to write them down. But if you also want to submit them in writing, that would be super helpful too. So thank you, Caitlin. That was great. Any other questions before we move on?
Yeah, I see Julia.
Yeah. Great.
Thank you. Okay. Sorry if this is a math question that might be addressed elsewhere, but as I'm looking at the equation that you've got at the bottom, you have that the debits or credits are equal to the scores times the unit of measure plus the adjustments. In my mind, debits and credits are always the difference between two conditions, either like pre and post. And so is that delta between either like that predicted versus existing conditions incorporated into that equation, or is the debits credits maybe not on the left side of the equal sign, more of, or is that equation actually the kind of current site value plus the adjustments? And also the idea that the adjustments are applied to either pre or post, or they are applied to the difference between those to get the debit or credit value. Sorry, does that make sense?
It does. And
okay,
it shows me that you're really on top of what we're talking about. Thank you, Julia. Great question. And we're using the debits and credits here. We don't have really another terminology that we've come up with. Maybe mitigation amount would be another way of putting it, because you're right, that delta is typically what we think of as like the mitigation requirement. And that difference, which I'll have on the next slide, like the pre and the post, that functional gain or loss is incorporated into this piece of the formula in the function scores. And then the adjustments you asked, oh, you said something about the adjustments. It was really good.
Well, the question is whether or not the adjustments are being applied to like the existing conditions or the post-project conditions, or is it like, I think of them as like mitigation ratios in terms of if your debit needs to be a 2-to-1, or maybe you're applying adjustment to say that you're too far away from your site, so we're going to increase the debits necessary for mitigation for a particular site. So like, is it being applied at the site level for pre or post, or is it to the kind of the overall need for credits?
That's a great question. And what we were able to do with adjustments is really fine tune them. So we do have one, and I'll get into that later, that can apply to the total post-project site level, the total amount. And then we also can apply the adjustments very detailed, really to a specific function that is related to why we're adjusting it, like vegetation. So we can do both. And I'll just restate again, it's applied on the total level, but it's not, because you're asking about like pre-post. We want to make sure we're not dinging, or not dinging is the wrong word, disincentivizing beneficial mitigation actions. And so that flows into some of the decision making. Like we ran into this with wetlands too. We don't want to disincentivize people planting trees and like
right, or like slow growing trees that may have major benefits 30 years from now, but 10 years from now will still be pretty small.
Yeah. So we've tried to keep that in mind. We didn't want to see like all mitigation become like shrubby willows. Not that there's anything wrong with shrubby willows, but we all know that they can mature fast, really fast. So we didn't want to do anything that would disincentivize that. So that's a goal, and we think we've hit that. But what would be incredibly helpful as well is if keep that in mind as I present this, and see if you find ways that this would still disincentivize someone from planting those slow maturing trees, or just other types of mitigation. You know, diversity is great in different types of mitigation. So thank you for those questions. I really appreciate how in tuned you folks are to what we're talking about. I know it's not 10:30 yet. The next slide, we start jumping into the math. I wonder if we should do that now or do a break and then jump into the math.
Yeah, how are folks feeling about taking a break at this point?
Break.
Okay, see some head nods, some thumbs up. All right, let's go ahead and take our break now, and we can reconvene in about 15 minutes. So if folks can return to their screens at about 10:40 a.m., we can jump into the map. Awesome. And before we turn back to the presentation, I just wanted to note there were some comments and additional questions in the chat related to the ESH designation. So just wanted to kind of follow up on those pieces relating to Caitlin's comment about ESH and making sure that it is applied to not just spawning habitat, but also rearing and migration. And so we see in the chat here, there's some disconnect maybe between the experience of how ESH is applied, the actual kind of rules in law around ESH, as well as, some additional information about where one can request a review of that ESH designation. There's a link that Daniel provided here in the chat so for folks to look at and use as needed to make sure that the ESH is being applied accurately. Melissa, I see your hand up.
I don't want to get too in the weeds or off topic, but every year that the request for new information has been
Oh, it's kind of hard to hear you, Melissa. Is it possible to lean a little bit closer to the mic?
Yeah, I have a sore throat.
Sorry.
Sorry. Yeah, this may be a topic for offline with DSL, but we have every year submitted information, and we are told that it doesn't fit the model, and that rearing does not constitute essential needs for or migratory behavior doesn't fit the mold. So that's why we're typing here, but this is probably a better conversation with a different branch of DSL.
Okay, thanks, Melissa. I just want to make sure I heard that correctly. So that when you've kind of used this form in the past, you've been it's been communicated that the migratory behavior doesn't qualify in that ESH designation. Is that right?
Correct.
Okay, great.
And that's something we can definitely, I want to look into a little more offline to make sure we've been properly assessing that. But speaking of migratory specifically, that is in the law. We don't get to change that part. We do include and should include rearing and spawning habitats. And so anyway, it'll be a matter of looking at the information, what our response was, and seeing whether it meets the definitions that we're limited to in rule. So we want to make sure good data is getting included, and if something doesn't meet the definition, then we should let somebody know why. So, but we can do that another time since it's not directly related to this.
Great, thanks, Charles. And just also, I see Caitlin, putting a finer point on that in the chat too, that the ESH habitat points then impact the SFAM model, and the SFAM model is only as good as the input data that goes into that. And some of the sources are incomplete if ESH isn't covering all the aspects of the sim audit life cycle. So that's great, very helpful. Thank you.
Yes, absolutely. And Charles and Daniel are two in-house experts on the ESH rulemaking process, whereas I'm at a user's level for understanding the ESH data. So they'll definitely be the folks you want to coordinate with offline for that. So what I'm going to do next, though, is start to roll into the math. This formula down here at the bottom is basically what I'm going to be walking you through. And for this first slide, I just want to note that this is the list of all 11 functions. This formula we do for each of the functions and then sort of wrap them all up to a sum at the end. And so there'll be times when I'm just showing you the math for one function just to simplify it. And what this is showing right now on the slide is that that delta that Julia mentioned earlier, that difference between the baseline, oh, I clicked, the baseline score and the predicted score. And then that delta is this gain or loss. And this is pretty typical of a project to have both gains and losses. It's rare that we see a project that has only losses unless like a stream's being like filled and moved somewhere else. Sometimes you see a lot of neutrals as well, like nothing's changing. So what we do basically to get this is, like you might expect, we subtract the baseline, so the existing conditions, from what's being predicted for that score. And that gives us sort of that, I know in the formula here it says SFAM function scores, but what this is really getting at is that delta that Julia mentioned, that difference. So that's the first piece of information that we use. And I am going to be showing sort of the raw math as we go through, but I do want to say we have we will be releasing a calculator to do this work for applicants. So we aren't expecting people to like sit down with lined paper and do the math for every single function. Right now we have a sort of prototype calculator that, for the project team who have been doing this a lot, it's pretty easy to work with. I would say for someone who hasn't been doing this work a lot, it's not, because it's just a big Excel spreadsheet that has all the formulas baked in. So we want to create something that's a lot more user friendly. So as I said, it's just a prototype, and I don't even have screenshots of it here because I think it's clearer for folks to just see the math itself. I see a hand up.
Yeah, Julia, over to you.
I have another math question. Two, actually. The first is, are all 11 of the functions equally weighted in the calculation?
That's a great question. So the functions are equally weighted. You didn't ask this, but I'll just say that the measures, so the things that we measure out in the field, each of these functions has like a formula, and you can look them up in SFAM. And those measures are not necessarily equally weighted for each function.
Sure. Yeah. Because they could have a lot of measures that actually go into a single function, but ultimately surface water storage gets the same weight as thermal regulation in terms of summing these up for the functions. Okay.
Sorry, I interrupted you, Julia.
No, that's okay. That it is now. All right. Which it sounds like potentially there's an option with the adjustments that maybe it isn't, if the site is particularly valuable for one function or not.
You're doing such a great job leading into my next slide. Thank you. Because yeah, the way we do it is with value weighting next.
Okay.
So at this point, when we're just figuring out the difference, we have that amount. So like a loss of 4.22 or a gain of 1.02. So that's the amount we have right now. So we haven't done any weighting yet, but that's what I'll show on the next slide.
Okay. And then the second question is, I think the answer is yes, that all of the functions, or at least as their functional scores are higher is better and closer to 0 is worse. Is that right?
Great question. You know, I've never been asked that in one of our trainings. That's a really good question. Yes, that is correct. 10 is considered the best and 0 would be the worst. And that isn't always the case with assessments. So it's good you brought that up, because sometimes assessments will score like stressors or disturbance or things like that. So a high score would actually mean disturbed or stressed. But for this case, yes, 10 is kind of the maximum score any of them can reach. And that range is based on actual stream data. It's called NARS data. It's like a national.
Yeah, the National Rivers and Streams.
Yes. Yeah, it's based on that data for the Pacific Northwest.
Okay, thank you.
Absolutely. Great questions. Okay. So to lead into what Julie was asking about with the weighting. And so when we were talking about the information SFAM provides, the value scores and the function scores, when we were talking about those with the TAC, we asked them a lot of questions related to how these should be used, if they should be used. And they were recommending that we definitely use the function scores, but also the value scores, because they're providing important context about what's happening in the watershed and the functions that this particular spot in the stream is providing. They also talked about, because we've seen, like, we have the rating as far as high, medium, low, and the scores, and they were recommending sticking with the scores because of the sensitivity that we have with SFAM. So that was our goal moving into this, was to use both the values and the functions. And we looked at a few different approaches to do that. And we couldn't, unfortunately, we couldn't do something simple like just adding the two together. There really wasn't like a scientific justification for that, or even mathematically. The two things, they were very different, so it didn't make sense to add them. What our end goal was basically you're having people mitigate for a loss of function, but if that function is highly valued, requiring a little more mitigation for it, having that be equivalent both to the amount of function that's lost and how highly it's valued. And so weighting is how we do that. And I'll show you the math on weighting in a minute, but it's important to note what weighting does is increase the amount of mitigation based on how highly something is valued. But that value score alone doesn't result in requiring mitigation. And 2 slides from now, I have a demonstration of that. But we thought that was important. So you're only either being credited for providing mitigation or being required to provide mitigation if there's an actual functional change. If the function's staying the same, you're avoiding it. You're not being required to mitigate for it. And so what that looks like mathematically, I'm just going to use one function from that earlier slide, that surface water storage. Oh, did I go? I went backwards. Okay. So to weight it, we have our baseline score of 4.02. We have a predicted score of 4.62 and a value score of 8. So this is a highly valued function. So that difference between those two function scores, that delta that we talked about earlier, is 0.6. So that's our piece from functions that's going into the calculation. The next piece is from values. So we take that 0.6 and we weight it by the value. And the way we do that is by turning the value into basically a percentage, 8 out of 10. So we had a score of 8 out of a possible 10. So 8 out of 10, or 0.8, multiplied by 0.6 gives us a total of 0.48. So that is what the value is contributing to the total. So those two together, rather than just taking our end scores and adding them together, we take the difference in our function and then the value weighted difference in that function and add them together to account for the function and value. And so that's what we see down here. The 0.6 plus the 0.48 equals 1.08. So that's the value weight and the function score combined. And again, because we're multiplying that value by the change in function, so multiplying the value here by the change in function, you only get an end result from this calculation if there is actually a change in function and actually a value, because there are times when we have a 0 for a value score. And I show that on the next slide. I think I'll roll to that slide and then we'll pause for questions. So there are 3 different function score or function examples from a real project: subsurface and surface water transfer, flow variation, and surface water storage. The existing score for each of them is provided here: 3.3, for subsurface and surface water transfer, 7.2 for flow variation, 2.5 for surface water storage. They each have a predicted function score. Increase for the water transfer, we increased it by 2.7. Flow variation didn't change at all. And surface water storage increased by 2.2. Though this one increased, there was no value score calculated. The end result based on the data entered, there was a value score of 0 for surface water transfer. So what that means, because there was no value, when you do that math, you end up with no value weighting, and thus we just have that difference in the functions here to be used in the within that long formula that I showed before. When there's no change in function, we also have no function or value calculated here. So there's a 0 there that would get entered into that, essentially meaning no mitigation calculation would be done for that function because there was no change in it. And then for surface water storage is where we have our change in functional score, 2.2. We create a value weight by multiplying 2.2 by our value score of 7.3 out of a total possible of 10. So that makes it 7.3, sorry, it makes it 0.73 times 2.2, which gives us that 1.6 that we can add back to the difference in function to get our total. So that's the end number from our SFAM output that gets used then in the calculation. And again, that's done for each of the functions. And we'll move on to a poll, but asking you about, like, you know, your impression, your feedback. So you'll get that option to do that. But before we go there, because we're changing to the next topic after this, I wanted to answer any questions you might have on either using those SFAM value function scores or on the value weighting piece. Okay, seeing none. Danielle, if we can go. Oh, no, there's a hand. Go
Yeah,
ahead.
Julia.
Sorry. I guess I'm a little, the first one I struggle a little bit with since the value score is 0. In my head, the math would make it 0 because it'd be 0 multiplied, because it'd be 0 divided by 10 multiplied by 2.7 to give me 0. And versus the second option where you have a value. I understand that there's no change because we're talking about the delta there, but I guess that's the piece, right? Is that it strikes me as a little interesting that piece, that the valuation score is designed to increase increase or theoretically decrease if your value somehow changed as a result of your project. The sort of importance of that function within the calculation. And so I don't know. I think I get it, but it also mathy wise makes my head go, wait.
And what I'm going to do is go back a slide. I don't have the formula on here, so I'm going to go back a slide. But first, let's hold in our head this piece here. And it is really unusual to have a 0, to be honest, like in the value. That's just uncommon. So, but let me go back. And so when we have 0 here and we're timesing it by a number, we do get 0. But then we add it back to that difference in functions. And so that's why we had the 2.6. So it was like, or was it 2.26 plus 0 for the total. And so, sorry, I didn't show that full math here. So we still have the change in function. We just don't have any additional value weighting on that.
Gotcha. Okay, that makes more sense. So it's kind of like there's if you were to have a second column in there in between the two, that is sort of the additional value not value added, but the evaluated function score. Got it. Thank you.
Yeah, and you mentioned like projects changing value, very uncommon. But an example of that is like passage barriers And I don't want to go down a rabbit hole of talking about mitigation for fish passage, because we could talk about that for days, but I'll just mention that the presence of a fish passage barrier has a lot of effect on value scores for the habitat value scores. And so that would change the ending value score. It is, like I said, pretty uncommon. We typically have the exact same value scores before and after a project. But what we are having folks do, this value score, we are having them use the post-project value score. So if they did manage to increase a value for a project, which is wonderful if it can happen, that does get accounted for in that math. So like you would get more mitigation credit because you're increasing that value, essentially.
Gotcha. Okay, no, that makes sense. Thank you.
Yeah.
And Melanie, before we move on, there's another question in the chat kind of related to this value score. So the value score never decreases value.
Correct. It proportionally increases it. So when we have a very low value score, like if this was only a 1, then you'd be multiplying this by 0.1. And so you'd have a very small number here. What would that be? 0.2 something that you would be adding back. So very small increase when the value is low, nearly negligible. But as this score goes up, the increase to the total goes up, but never reduces it. These are such good questions. Okay, let's launch that poll.
Okay, so I got a few responses, about 9. I'm going to end the poll and share the results.
Okay. Great. All right. Great. I'm glad you guys are following and for the most part supporting of this idea. Again, we can get more feedback from you guys at the end next month. Or if you want to just discuss in greater depth, we do have office hours. And if those can't work with your schedule, let us know and we will work on an alternative. So the next topic for us to jump into from the calculation is the unit of measure. Very, very exciting topic. This was one, just as an interesting side note, the project team, we kind of took them in order as I'm showing you. And this was one that the project team was probably the most unsure of where we would end up, because we knew we just needed to test a lot of examples. Because when we worked with the technical advisory committee, they said, yeah, you need to look at feet, you need to look at area, you need to look at all these different options, test them all out, kick the tires, see which one is the most logical. Because what it's doing is it's acting as like this multiplier that basically takes those numbers we were just talking about and quantifying those numbers that represent like a quality evaluation, and it's like quantifying it, giving it like a metric, a number to that. And what this figure is illustrating is all the different types of units of measure that we tested using mostly real projects. We got a bunch of real project examples, but there were some that came to mind that we didn't have a real example of, but we thought, ooh, this'll be a tricky one. Let's try that. So we did use some hypothetical examples as well. And what these pictures are showing is that we had we looked at an area polygon of the total project. We looked at an area polygon of just the impact within the channel, like that jurisdictional in-channel area of impact. We looked at the channel for the entirety of the length of the impact. So not just the impact area, but the whole channel, even the part of the channel that was outside the impact for the length of where there was impact. So quite a few variations on area. And then for linear, we also looked at like a straight line between start and like the beginning and the end of a project. And then we looked at like the stream length. So that sinuous sort of measurement, like keeping a center line between the banks. So the way we tested these out was we took all these real project examples and we inputted the data into our calculation using all these different units of measure for all those different project types. So it's really interesting outcomes. But we used projects like stream bank stabilizations that occurred on one side of the stream or on both sides of the stream. We looked at culverts and bridges and boat ramps, so things that were more like perpendicular to the stream and either fully crossing it, or like a boat ramp would be like halfway across it. We did look at some small structures, you know, like an outfall in the bank, or even like there's sometimes structures down in like the bed of stream. We also looked at, you know, beneficial projects. So like in-stream habitat structures, like all the different variations like you could find in the manuals. We tried to find projects with all of those, whether it was wood or riffles or any of those things. And one of the most challenging, we looked at projects that had a change in stream length. We're probably familiar with projects that remeander streams or put them back into a natural position. Sometimes it'll even, it'll adjust it. Typically we see longer, but sometimes shorter is more natural. There's a strange example of that in Salem where a stream had been made basically to do a 90. And so the remeander made it technically shorter, but much healthier. So lots of different examples we looked at. And we had to use like a large matrix to examine these. And then we had to go through the process of asking ourselves, what would make this a good unit of measure? Like, how do we compare these? And so some of the things were just right off the bat, like with the project, can we easily, looking at the project designs, identify what the amount is, like what the area is within the stream bed of XYZ, or plus the riparian area. So we had to be able to look at the project design and easily identify that. And be included like already in the application. So we aren't asking for extra work. And then we had to think about SFAM and the space that SFAM is representing, and make sure that it correlates with that and doesn't introduce other kinds of multipliers. So like increases and decreases that were based on the layout of the project rather than a change in functions. And it was, I already mentioned it was, or we wanted something that was included in the application already, preferably also something that was part of like your SFAM evaluation, like the measurements you put down for that. And then we wanted there to be equivalency, whether you're like the person providing mitigation or you're doing an impact project, or maybe you're the person doing both. We wanted to have balance and equivalency on both sides of that. So through that long process, what we resulted in is right here in bold, that our proposed unit of measure is linear feet of stream on the center line. And what is really the most important take home that I always try and emphasize, especially for people who might be working in other places, is that this is what's appropriate for Oregon, because the most scientifically and mathematically credible or appropriate unit of measure to use in mitigation programs is always specific to the assessment method that program's using. And so other states have other methods. For us, we have SFAM, and because of the way SFAM is laid out, as I'm reminding you guys here in this picture, and because the way the assessment areas are proportional to stream size based on width. So width is accounted for, and then it's laid out on this linear length. That meant that this linear measure, because of the way SFAM is aligned on this linear stretch of stream and providing us information on the quality of that stream along that linear measure, that meant that linear feet of stream was the best unit of measure for us, for our program. And we retested area quite a few times. And the reason that we really couldn't settle on area was because what kept happening was that there would be a discrepancy being introduced with area, where a project with a different, like if you looked at the alternatives of a project, it wasn't impacting functions differently, but it could have very significant effects on the end result of the calculation, the end amount of mitigation required, or the end amount of mitigation being provided. So this alternate layouts had changes or increases or decreases that were outweighing the change in the stream functions, which was really, we considered to be pretty unjustified. We really were more interested in those measurable stream changes that we see when conducting an SFAM. And there are still some challenges with linear feet. One that comes up a lot is like multiple channel streams, you know, braided channels, things like that. But we can address those through different guidance on how to implement an SFAM or how to apply an SFAM, for example. So there are other ways we can address the fewer challenges that we found with linear feet, and we don't need to make special considerations in the calculation, more about how things are applied in the field. And so I do have, I think it's our last poll, and it's on kind of your initial feedback on this unit of measure. We can do questions before the poll if there are any, or the other topics, because next we're going to go into adjustments. Okay, let's go ahead and launch the poll.
Okay, we have same amount of people who replied to the last poll. Oh, got another person. I'm gonna go ahead and end the poll now.
Okay.
And share the results.
Okay. Okay. So one thing that I could do for office hours, as well as maybe an abbreviated version at the next meeting, is bring out some of the examples we tested that might give people more information. If folks think that's a good idea, I can go there. Or if there's some other type of information that would be helpful, you guys can let me know and I could bring that to you. As I said, our team went over this for quite a long time. So me trying to provide it to you in 2 slides, I completely understand the need for more information. Very, very valid. But before we move on to adjustments, I'm happy to take other questions about unit of measure or the other pieces of the equation.
Jonas, do you want to jump in here?
Yeah, so I understand how difficult it must be to try to figure out which unit of measure would be appropriate. I guess the thing that comes to mind in terms of creating mitigation is that, you know, is it going to incentivize making really narrow streams? It is a lot less expensive to build, you know, much smaller channels if you're creating streams. And there's a lot higher cost than actually, you know, we've done some enhancement on perennial channel banks, and it's a lot more expensive to pull back an eroded channel when you've got a 20-foot vertical drop into the perennial waters to get the same amount of linear feet credit. There's a big cost differential there. And from a scientific standpoint, you know, stuff like a hyphoreic zone or the vegetation and the habitat associated with a wider stream would be larger than a narrower stream. So I understand how SFAM's using linear feet for most of the measurements, and the fact that we're kind of normalizing things by using the bank full width as a measure of how long the survey needs to be. So I know there's a correlation there, I believe, between width and length, but still, I think, again, from a habitat standpoint, more is better, and width has something to do with that.
That is a really interesting and good question, Jonas. You mentioned width. One of the things that we worried about as we were testing this and considering linear feet, and one of my hesitations was knowing about a stream mitigation program in another state, that every stream mitigation bank has a stream with the exact same sinuosity. Based on how they designed their program, it incentivized a very certain amount of length. And so similar to what you said with width, we were really worried about incentivizing things being unnaturally sinuous, you might say. And you made great points about the importance of the hypereic zone. And what the team came back to, and I would love to get more feedback from you on this after you've had some time to think about it, is that we couldn't solve those programmatic issues with the accounting formula or with the unit of measure. We needed to be able to trust in the review process and the earlier steps, sort of like appropriate siting, like putting a mitigation in an appropriate place. That decision is made earlier on. So we kind of had to trust, for our concern about sinuosity, we had to trust that the reviewers early in the process would see, well, this is an unnaturally sinuous, this is an appropriate, kick it back, design it more appropriately. I hadn't thought about width actually, so thank you for bringing that up. I would hope we would do a similar thing, but I think we need to think more about that and how we would evaluate whether that's a natural width for a stream, as well as how that relates back to eligibility pieces. So
I mean, when I mentioned width, I guess I was mentioning that in relation to area, not necessarily, you know, you wouldn't buy credit based on width and length, you'd buy it based on area. But what I've, you know, we've been selling stream credits in Washington County for a year now, and in our mitigation bank instrument, we have area and linear feet listed because we weren't sure which way things were going to go in the decision-making process. And what we've seen over the last year is that for narrower streams, you know, DSL or the permit reviewer has been allowing permittees that have narrows like a ditch to, we've been using the width as a way to convert linear feet so that a person that's impacting a narrower water feature like a ditch versus a wider stream actually has been buying less credit from us. So it's almost like currently the permits that have, over the last year, there's been an incentive, or I don't know if it's an incentive, but it's been in consideration if you have a narrow stream. So I guess it's just, it doesn't seem like DSL is currently following what is proposed, in which case we'd always just go by linear feet and not even worry about the area. And I'm not sure if you're aware of this or not. You know, I know you're not on the permitting side.
I haven't been handling those permits. Similarly, you know, we have those other mitigation programs like payment in lieu, and we do have those struggles currently that you're describing with widths and lengths. And I will agree with you that consistency is a real challenge right now with our program, as I mentioned earlier, since we do it case by case, which you're feeling. So I'd like to look at that more. So thank you for your comments, and make sure that we accounted for that and make sure that there isn't something we could do within this piece of the program, like the accounting part, or if it needs to be addressed through another policy.
Okay. Yeah, I'll follow up. Thanks.
Great.
Thanks, Jonas. Julia?
This may just be following on, but I'm thinking of, you know, the concern with linear feet, maybe disincentivizing projects going further out into the riparian zone. I'm thinking like, you know, potentially a project area that's has the potential to be significantly wider and go beyond just say 2 bankful widths to do tree planting and things like that. That would be incredibly valuable, especially say in an urban area where we don't have much stream corridor. With your testing, have you noticed that sort of the wider projects don't necessarily rise up as high? Like, is that those larger area projects that may be relatively short from a stream length perspective, but kind of wide from the going further out into the floodplain in the riparian area, less valued with the accounting using stream length versus say area or another measure for the unit of measure?
So none of our units of measure went that further out, so we weren't able to compare anything that went. Let me see if I. Here we go. We didn't go beyond like project footprint, like to take it further out for the impact concepts. So we didn't have one that looked at a project that was, for example, way further out. And then the other thing that I'll say with SFAM, you see where we collect the data for SFAM, there is one question. Well, there's the value questions that look at things, you know, far outside of what's on this map that you do, like in the office. But then
Right.
you're in the field, there is one question that asks about the riparian width beyond this point, like just how far does it keep going? Do you have a continuous riparian area? So it's only that one answer that influences it. So it doesn't have, I would say, a strong push on the SFAM results. And as far as like incentivizing greater riparian widths, I don't know of a way our program could focus on doing that. I will say historically, a common issue we have with mitigation is only getting riparian planting for street mitigation, even though the actions are happening somewhere else. But
And changing the channel as opposed to just planting some trees.
Yes, correct.
Sure. Because
Yeah,
I'm thinking,
but
sorry, please continue.
if you have a project that had that longer riparian area, wider riparian area that we could run through the test, I'm always happy to test more examples.
Okay, we have a couple that we've implemented in Portland, and I'm thinking of them. It might be more fair to think of them as more like floodplain projects, and recognizing that they what was there to start with looks a lot more like what's on the screen right now, but you talked about like excess sinuosity. Some of these are not necessarily overly sinuous, but they are more so that that project area, at least post-project, is significantly larger in width as it from like the top of the project to the other. But if you're just following the channel itself, some of that new floodplain that is active and will be able to have increased water storage and have a lot of benefit may not necessarily get captured in that bank full width of just twice that width. And so those are the ones that kind of came to mind. And it might be that I'm just not thinking of them quite right in terms of how they would feed into the SFAM assessment, but those are the ones that kind of show up of these larger footprint projects that really could have a lot of substantial benefit because they are wider and funkier in shape, may not necessarily show up as beneficial in the calculations.
Those sound really interesting. I would very much like to see those examples.
Okay.
You could share
Yeah.
those.
Maybe an office hour.
Fantastic. Yeah.
Okay.
And I will also mention, I didn't say this earlier, but our worry about it making things overly sinuous wasn't the fact that we thought someone would be gaming the system or that sinuosity is bad. It was that what we've seen in other states is that the sinuosity was having to be held in place through a lot of hardened structures. So they would make these hardened rock riffles to just lock the stream into that sinuous, because the water didn't want to stay that way.
Sure. They didn't want it to move. They wanted to stay.
Yeah, because it's about the lessons you learn from your partners in other states. You know, that program had incentivized the stream staying in place based off of, you know, credit releases and performance standards. So it's just something we wanted to be very cognizant of, where we weren't creating an unnatural locked in stream. Yeah, I realized I didn't include that statement before. All right. So my next couple slides are on adjustments. So just first, kind of an overarching information about adjustments is just this is sort of everything we didn't capture in that the steps we've already talked about, either the eligibility piece or the math that we just did based on that, you know, kind of pre and post 10-year SFAM timeline. So it would be something that isn't reflected in the difference in those function scores, isn't captured in the value scores. Temporal loss is an example of things that don't get captured sometimes. And we can also use them as a way to encourage certain actions or other tools that get developed. And so when we worked with our technical advisory committee, they were recommending adjustments for long-term site protection because guaranteeing that those functions will continue to occur and be provided into the future was valuable enough that they felt an adjustment for that made sense. They also, temporal lag for vegetation development, that's a pretty common adjustment you see, not just with our wetland program, but throughout programs across agencies and states. They also recommended an adjustment for channel complexity, which we aren't proposing. We could in future do a rulemaking to add additional adjustments in. The formula and approach accounts for that, but we don't have enough scientific support or information to do either the channel complexity adjustment. We looked at a few other adjustments as well, but we didn't have confidence in applying those consistently across the board. So what adjustments can do though is increase or decrease mitigation amounts. So unlike values where it just sort of proportionally increase, these ones can increase or decrease depending on how we use them. And we looked at those 11 functions. We can take an adjustment and do it directly on that function if that's the most appropriate thing. For example, some functions are increased or decreased based on presence of woody vegetation, others presence of shrubs, and others, herbaceous or emergent vegetation. So those different functions could have that adjustment applied directly to them to make it more fair. And then others can be applied across all of them. So kind of to our total, when that's the most appropriate, when it's something that affects all the functions, such as site protection. And so that those two approaches can be done for any future adjustments that come along that the program wants to take on and add into with a future rulemaking. But again, at this time, we're not proposing a bunch of others. And you'll notice when you look at the rule language, we're actually consistent with what's already being proposed in wetlands. So there actually isn't a bunch of rule language that says, streams will have these 3 adjustments, because it's already what we're doing for wetlands. We're going to do it with streams in a specific way to streams. So that have that good consistency. And yeah, like I said, we have to do things differently for streams, just so that it applies in a fair and appropriate way with this accounting formula. And the intent of all of them is that the mitigation ratio wouldn't drop below an equivalency to like a 1-to-1. What we think of as like, so we're not like having people provide less stream function and mitigation than what's being lost. And that's the same as we have for wetlands. We kind of have a cutoff where we can't reduce it below that 1-to-1. That's a federal consistency piece along with an Oregon statutory piece. That's important. And so the first adjustment I wanted to talk to folks about, as I've been indicating as I talked, is about vegetation and the time it takes for vegetation to develop. And the reason we're having an adjustment for that is we didn't want the SFAM, the post-project SFAM, to reflect the condition right after the site is completed. But we know that there's a lag in recovery. So for example, and again, we're not talking about the mitigation site, but at the impact site, somebody, they knock down the vegetation, they have to clear an area, the shrubs start to regrow, they replant trees. So the site does start to bounce back, but there's a loss of function in the interim. So even though you're doing an assessment 10 years out that might show that all the shrubs have recovered and that the trees are starting to get big, there was still that lag time when the functions that vegetation could be supporting wasn't happening. And so that's really that piece that we're looking at applying an adjustment for, and again, just at the impact site. And what we're doing is tiering it based on vegetation. This is comparable to what's done with wetlands, and that's tiered based on like time it takes for different types of vegetations to grow back or to grow after being planted. And again, only applying to the functions that presence of vegetation influences those functional scores. So we're also structuring it mathematically similar to wetlands, where there's a 3% is the number. Like you have to have some sort of math for this adjustment. So what's universally used in our wetlands program, in many other programs, is a 3%. We call it a discount rate, but it's just the rate of like loss of function due to this vegetation. And that comes from the habitat equivalency analysis, or HEA, that NOAA has. Basically, they use a 3% per year for delay in maturity of vegetation. And again, you'll find this being used in a lot of different tools. It's kind of the standard approach. So what that means is that we have different percentages for herbaceous, shrub, and tree based on how long it takes for that vegetation to bounce back, because we're saying 3% per year. And so 15% for herbaceous impacts is thinking that it takes about 5 years for loss of herbaceous vegetation to fully bounce back. And there are only 2 functions that are, the scores are affected by observations of herbaceous vegetation while conducting an SBAM, and that's chemical regulation and nutrient cycling. And then, so for moving on to the shrub adjustment, we're using 20% there, because shrubs can take longer to grow from planting or reestablish after cutting down. And that's based on a 7-year timeline for shrubs. So 3% for 7 years. And that for both shrubs and for trees, there are 6 different functions that those adjustments are applied to. And they're listed here on the slide: biodiversity, creating and maintaining habitat, sustaining trophic structure, nutrient cycling, chemical regulation, and thermal regulation. And I'll just note that thermal regulation is that functional score is completely dependent on that shading from trees and other shade sources. And then the next tier is that tree dominated. And the reason it's only 30% is because of that 10-year timeline for when the post-project assessment is done. So you're doing a predicted condition with 10-year-old trees if you're planting trees at your impact site. And so that loss of function for those 10 years is what you're being adjusted for. And so that's why it's 30%, the 3% over 10 years. And these are not additive. So when your project has impacts, you remove all these types of vegetation, you're not being dinged at like 50 or 65%. 30% over 6 functions is the max. And I have a slide that shows this mathematically, but maybe if there's questions about kind of the general concept first, we can take those. Okay, seeing none, this slide is showing 6 different functions that when you lose either trees or shrubs are getting adjusted. And for this project example, trees were removed. And so this is a tree adjustment. And you'll notice that for when there's a gain in function, as the first example, maintaining biodiversity, there was an increase in maintaining biodiversity for this project. But with the adjustment, the amount went down, but it's still an increase. So similarly, there was a decrease in function creating and maintaining habitat, and that decrease went down. Or sorry, there was more decrease. It's a larger negative number. I'm not sure the right way to say that mathematically, but it went from negative 88.2 to negative 144.7. And so you see that true for these others as well. And thermoregulation, there was no change in function. So there's nothing in the end because that functional score didn't change. Any questions on those? The total for this project, this is like a real project example. When you went through all, not just these 6 functions, but all 11 functions, the total at the end was 986.9 before being adjusted for tree loss. And after it was 667.4. So still a net gain in functions for the project, but reduced because of that functional loss due to trees being cut down.
Okay, we have a couple hands up for questions. Just a quick time check. We have about 10 minutes left of this section, a few more slides before we get to interested party comments. So just everyone keep that in mind with your questions. Caitlin, over to you. Oh, you're on mute still.
Could you walk through the thermal regulation 0 score, given that DEQ is basically putting all temperature TMDLs through a shade calculator to estimate improvements? It seems odd that you would get a 0 score when you're removing trees.
The existing function score was 0, meaning that they when they were measuring the shade over the stream, they weren't, the condition was already bad, I would say. It was already like an exposed sunny stretch. But the project itself still did remove the trees, even though they weren't, in that measured area. So this function was 0, it stayed 0. Oops. And so that is kind of an odd example from this particular project, that it had a 0 both times. And I'm trying to remember, no, this wasn't the one. There was one where loss of trees had to do with lengthening a culvert. But yeah, if it had trees ahead of time that were shading the stream and influencing this thermoregulation function, because that's like a direct measurement at the stream edge that influences that functional score, then this would have been a larger, like if that had been lost, this would have been a larger or a negative number. But because there wasn't any shade at that stream's edge when they started, it stayed 0 after. But for these other scores, because removal of trees in general is like trees throughout the riparian area of the project, because those also influence these other functions, that's really the kind of tree removal these other functional losses is getting at, rather than just the stuff that's right on the stream edge and directly shading it. Any other?
Yeah, Brian, over to you. Brian, do you have a question? If you're talking, you're still on mute.
I apologize. I'm thinking about it. It appears it's a wholesale 30% adjustment for loss of trees, regardless of the amount of trees or the size of trees. And maybe are there considerations for that that are made behind the scenes, both amount and size?
Yes, we don't have any specific rule or written guidance, and that won't be incorporated into rule. But because it's an adjustment, that means that the applicant and the permit evaluator would be looking at the permit details to determine if it's appropriate to apply this adjustment for that particular project. So as you said, if like one tree was removed far away and the permit reviewer, because we still have humans doing this, we aren't having AI do it. Sorry, I had to get a little AI joke in there. So there still will be that like perspective of, is this an appropriate adjustment to apply in this scenario? And you did mention tree size. So I'll just note, one of the cool features of SFAM is that your scores are affected by the presence of very large trees, like based on diameter width. So if you happen to be lucky enough to have a well-aged riparian area, you'll have really high functions. Loss of those will have a significant influence on functional scores. It won't be a different percentage adjustment here, but you'll see a big effect on the function scores between pre and post if you were to cut down those large trees, because that would be then shown in your post project assessment scores.
Yeah, I guess that might be hone in on one of my concerns, that there's a double effect, where there's not only an effect on the functional scores from the measures, but there's also an adjustment that comes along with it afterwards. So I guess is there a double take or double effect that's occurring for removal of trees?
I haven't seen that in the math, but we could dig into that more, because that's an interesting question, and we certainly don't want to be like doubling up. But because we're trying to focus in on it being that lag in the 10-year timeline is why we have the 30%. So that is supposed to, the intent of that is supposed to account for in the predicted score, there is the presence of a tree or a shrub or herbaceous vegetation, but throughout that 10-year timeline, they're able to provide the same level of function for those full 10 years is the intent of the percentages based on that 10-year timeline instead of for all time, which is more what happens if you don't replant, for example. You wouldn't have the presence of those trees in your predicted function score. Not sure if that totally got at your question. If you have an example that we could run through, happy to do that again to make sure that we can check the numbers and it is not sending up another red flag that something is, out of whack or duplicative, like you mentioned.
Yeah, thank you. I'll provide an example.
Great. I love examples. The more I can test this out, the better. I've tested it as much as I can get my hands on things. So yeah, that would be great. Okay.
Awesome. There's one more question in the chat here. Why isn't maintain biodiversity listed as function related to herbaceous?
Oh, when you're measuring things in the field, it's not a measure that's used in calculating that function. And that if that's feedback that folks want to provide that it should be, then that's something that could be provided on SFAM for when we consider future versions of SFAM. So kind of outside the scope of what we can change through rulemaking, but still technical feedback we'd be interested in hearing about for the next time we need to do updates to our functional assessments, because those need to grow and change over time as we understand ecosystems more and as other information comes out. Okay, and so my next slide here, just another example of trade-offs, and this is showing like the full 11 scores here, how they were adjusted for tree loss and what the totals ended up. So just wanted to give like a real example of this before we move on to long-term site protection adjustments. And that is our next example here.
Just a quick kind of time check. We have about 2 minutes left of this section of the agenda. What do you think about pausing for today on this piece, and we can pick back up with the site adjustments and the rest of the slides at our next meeting?
We only have 2 slides, so it might actually work.
Okay.
People are okay with that. Yeah.
Right.
Because I think this is a simpler concept, perhaps, and I'll introduce it. And if it turns out we have a lot of questions on it, we can go over these slides again next time. But The purpose of this is really to reflect the fact that when you protect a site long-term and guarantee that those functions will be there, it's really valuable. And right now, we don't have consistent long-term protection for stream mitigation sites, especially permitting responsible small sites. You know, when it goes into a mitigation bank, those get protected. But what we're trying to do is incentivize like long-term presence of these functions. And we do have an adjustment like this in wetlands. So you'll notice that it's already there in rule. In wetlands, there's just a simple like yes or no. If there's enhanced site protection, 20% adjustment up, or it stays as it is. But what we're actually going to be doing for streams is a tiered adjustment, because as I said, there's really like, even in rule, it says it may or may not be required for streams. So what we're doing is tiering it. So you could have a 10% increase just for having like a deed restriction or an agency approved natural resource management plan with some stewardship funding, something to make sure those functions maintain. But then it would be a 20% increase for a higher level of protection, like a conservation easement or fee title by a land trust. And so that's what this slide is showing, is that 10% for the kind of the first level, and then 20% for the second. And then the math is what I wanted to show you guys. Yeah, so this is a banking example where this particular site, 10 out of the 11 functions had an increase. The stretch of stream was over 1,000 feet. So the total number of credits that work, increasing 10 of those functions on that length of stream, provided 42,926 credits. But if you were to increase that with a basic site protection or a more advanced, you could see you could bring that all the way up to 51,000 credits through that site protection. And my next slide is just a summary slide. So I think we can pop that up, and then just if there's questions before we move on to interested party comments, I'll just leave this one up for people to read through in the meantime. Okay. Hearing no comments.
Jonas has a question here.
Great.
And I raised my real hand that time. So when it comes to accounting, are you thinking that if you have a site that has a perennial component and an intermittent, and I'm sure you know which site I'm asking about, are you going to want to have separate credit calculation for the intermittent stream versus the perennial? I know it's difficult with SFAM because having a perennial stream with side channels affects the scores. And so, you know, I know for this particular example, we did 3 SFAMs, you know, one for the intermittent, one for the perennial, one for the overlap of the two, a prediction of all of it. So yeah, do you think that when it comes to actually doing the crediting, we're going to combine intermittent and perennial into selling? When somebody needs credits, we just have it combined, just like wetlands. We combine HGM classes and Calverton classes into one unit wetland credit. Do you have an idea about how that will work?
I do. Spot on, Jonas. You brought up wetlands, and we are going to keep that consistency with wetlands. And so for folks who may not be super familiar with our banking, it's kind of true of all of our mitigation programs. The main thing that we like make sure to be divided about, like 2 separate buckets of credits, is whether it's wetland or stream or some other waters type. Those are separate amounts. So separate accounts, separate, but however you want to think about it, the pools of credits are separate. But what we currently do and will continue to do is, for a site that's selling credits like a bank, they don't have to individually track every credit and subtract it from the forested part of their site, the emergent part of their site, the riverine flow through part. We don't make people do line by line by line accounting. We kind of bin them all together. We plan to do the same thing for streams. So while you may have to do a separate SFAM just to get your total number of credits for the different areas of your site, just like if your site also has wetlands, you do an ORWAP. But those separate SFAMs would be used then in separate calculations. But again, boop, bin together for the total amount of stream credits you're selling, because that's the way our program works right now. There was
That's great.
possibility of that changing on the federal level, but I don't think that's going to happen. So for the long-term future, as we see it happening, it's going to continue like you're used to.
Thanks.
Yeah.
Great. And Brad, I see your hand up. Just a quick note, we're a little bit over time on this section. So maybe this will be the last question, and then we can circle back with any other questions about this at our next RAC meeting or in office hours. So Brad, really quick question, over to you.
Yeah, so I guess we're wrapping up this this presentation. I'm concerned with the implementation, and maybe we'll get into this in the future, but regarding payment in lieu and how this gel, you know, how the value weighted functions will convert into prices for the payment in lieu calculator. And I didn't see anything in the rules as reading through there to address that. So I think that's going to be a big shift, since we'll probably be using that most often across the state, since there's not an availability of credits out there.
It's a good question, Brad. And the answer at this stage is that we don't have a way of converting payment in lieu calculations over to function-based accounting, because payment in lieu is all based on someday there will be a project to replace what's being lost. So we have no baseline and predicted conditions to use for that calculation, because there's no mitigation site when using payment in lieu. So at this point, we're not proposing changes to payment in lieu that incorporate functions. We can talk more about that offline, but that's where we're at right now. It's basically not part of this rulemaking. Okay.
Thanks, Brad. Okay, moving into our interested party comments time, we'd like to invite non-RAC members or interested parties to share any comments related to the Division 85 rules for the RAC's consideration. And just a reminder, this is not considered formal public comment at this time. So to make a comment, please raise your hand. We'll go by order in which we see the hands raised. And we'll give you a maximum of 3 minutes to speak, or encourage you to keep comments short so others can also provide comments in our 10-minute time period. And just another note, if you have any questions for DSL staff, we encourage you to submit those questions via email. And so if we encourage you to keep your comments at this point as comments and feedback for the RAC members to consider. And just a flag, formal public comment will be accepted during the public comment period that will be occurring later in 2025. So with that, just wanted to open it up to any interested parties to share any comments. I'm not seeing any hands going up. We just want to check to see if anyone had any comments. Please do raise your hand at this time. Okay, seeing none, I think we can go ahead and move on to next steps.
Great, thank you. All right, just to kind of keep it short, next RAC meeting, June 12th, 1 to 4 p.m. This is a different time than what we originally scheduled. So the calendars were updated last week. So just as a reminder, new date and time for the next RAC meeting. The office hours for the RAC members will still be held that Monday, June 9th at 10. These are like drop-in, so if you're not available right at 10 o'clock, you can come at any time between 10 and 11. And just a reminder, these are like for technical questions, you know, about what was talked about today and what we'll be talking about at the next meeting. It's not really a time for like comments on rules on how we should adjust them. You'll want to have those for the RAC meeting. So this is just like technical questions, clarifications, things like that. And if you're unable to attend or do not have an alternate, and you have comments about the rules that we're going to be covering next month, you can send those comments in writing to Samantha or Maria by close of business on June 10th. And what we'll do is we'll read those into the record when, you know, if you identify like, you know, rule that, you know, which rule you have a comment on, we'll, Sam will read that comment when we're discussing that rule so that the RAC can discuss it. All right. And that's it for me. Thank you.
Okay, awesome. Well, thank you all so much for the questions, the discussion for today's meeting, and we will look forward to seeing everyone on June 12th.